Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as always by Mr. Tucker Hazel, and we're here today to litigate a topic that has simply never been discussed before, and that
Ooh.
is the merit, the value, and the pitfalls of video game remakes and remasters.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we're going to get too hung up really on the semantics of the terms here.
No.
You
Because
can
we're going
go,
to use them all in conversation.
yeah.
And they're all basically meaning the same thing right now. Even though they have different definitions.
Yeah, I mean, if you really want to know the difference, as we know the difference, and we're going to be sort of implicitly using it, just go look it
Yeah.
up. It's not that hard to find that information.
No. And it's not also in contention either. So,
No, it's not. We got a lot of great submissions here
yeah.
from you guys, the community, about largely why you dislike remakes, but there's some real shills among
Yeah.
us who
Yes.
who do like remakes, like
Mm-mm-mm.
like Tucker and I. And so we just want to chat about this because it's a hot button issue, you
Yeah.
might say.
Yeah, sure, yeah. This is a top of the ballot issue right now.
So, Tucker, I'm not even really sure where you want to begin because I'm not in your head.
Wow, that's salient to say the least. Um, well, the reason why we started thinking about this as a topic is that in recent times there have been many people who see the company remaking a game, making a big reveal, be a trailer that is
Yeah.
a remake of a game, a re-release of something, and people quite often bemoan the lack of creativity in the games industry, the obsession with the past, and reluctance to move on to newer things.
Yeah.
And this was brought up in our server the other day when our friend Daniel, who we've been talking to for years, and we appreciate him and respect him, he went on a
Sergeant
pretty
Dan.
Sergeant Dan, yeah, of my Star Wars Show fame. No, wait, the other one. No, that's Backcod Banter. Whatever. I'm getting hung
It
up.
doesn't
Semantics.
matter.
And no one knows about that anyway. So now we're on a little tangent that really gets people confused. Daniel went on a little tirade against remakes, and he claimed that he would rather see no one do any remakes, any remasters for games because he just wants new games. And on precedent or on principle, I don't completely disagree with him. For me, I think that new games are the most important and
Yeah.
interesting thing that a game dev team can do. But as I was reading some of the complaints that he was levying, and then also I'm doing some just general looking around online so I could more familiarize myself with the critiques and complaints against remakes, and then thinking back to arguments or conversations I've had in the past about the importance or use of remakes, I really do think there's a lot of misunderstanding that goes
Sure.
into what people feeling like remakes are overtaking new games, that they're taking away too many resources. I'm sure we in the games community have heard all of these talking points, but I do want to use what knowledge I do have to try to elucidate why I think a lot of these complaints aren't as fully founded as people
Yeah.
might think. I think it's more maybe of an emotional reaction, which I think is fair enough. But I do think when you start breaking things down, I think it really starts to make a lot more sense from a financial point of view, from a creative point of view, a resources point of view, a development point of view. There's a lot of stuff that I think goes into making it actually one of the more beneficial and important elements of the modern game market than I think people give them credit for.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of it's not a new game, so therefore it's X, Y, and Z. And I want to break down why I think that's not necessarily fair.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of a good time to have this conversation also because obviously
Mm-hmm.
we do a lot of covering of and playing of Nintendo games. And
Sure.
obviously the period really from holiday 2023 through the start of 2025 has been filled with a lot of remakes, starting back
Mm-hmm.
with
Yeah.
Mario RPG remake, and obviously Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. At this
Yeah.
point in the year, so far still the only game Nintendo's released.
True.
Um, and even among just Nintendo's slate, there's so many different points to get into that, for me, help affirm what you're saying, which is not even just that remakes are good, which I think they
Yeah.
are, and ports and remasters, and we've got different comments that'll touch on these different types of
Yeah.
re-releases. But I think there's also just sort of, as you were saying, a lack of clarity. I mean, for
Sure.
example, a game like Donkey Kong Country Returns HD,
Yeah.
it's not taking away any resources because it's
No.
made by Forever Entertainment, whose
Yeah. We'll
sole
get into
job
that.
is
Yeah.
to make ports and make
Mm-hmm.
remasters and full remakes.
Yeah.
The full remakes they
And they're
do
great
much.
at it.
That's good. full remakes are much worse than their remasters, but that's a different conversation. Let's actually, though, let's go to Daniel, because Daniel not only
Yeah.
pushed the ball down the hill, but
Yes.
he had a little snow to it as it was snowballed out into a larger topic here.
Sure. So was the ball already made of snow, or was it like some miscellaneous substance that the snow could then stick to?
Well, I kind of changed my metaphor because you know when
Yeah, you did. Yes.
you get a little snowball and you push it down the hill, it becomes a bigger snowball.
I've
But
heard
I didn't
such thing.
specify. It could have been like a
Yeah.
rubber ball, and those don't, you know. But it's important to remember, Tucker, that a Rolling Stone gathers no moss. I'm gonna say
But a
Rolling
rolling
Stone,
snowball gathers some snow.
right? I was gonna like, oh, but remember, even a stone can gather moss, but it can't unless it's sitting still. But Daniel says the
Wow.
following here. When I hear a developer I love announcing a remake or remaster, my first thought is this game playable on current hardware?
Yeah.
I don't disparage people for playing or wanting games to get a remake or remaster. That's just not what I want from developers. I'd rather see them make a new game in the series or a reboot. I'm kind of tired of seeing all remake remaster announcements. I just want new games and for the old games to be playable on modern hardware.
Sure.
And I think that's an important complication sort of where Daniel is coming from, because it's not just that he doesn't want to go back and jump into a game's history, or that he doesn't want the past to be brought to the present.
Yeah.
I think he's disagreeing sort of about technique and is more interested in kind of what, you know, services like Nintendo Switch Online or PlayStation Plus are doing, of simply saying, you know, here are these older games running in this cleaner format. Just go check them out. Warts and all, this is the game as you remembered it, and here's some meta features. Here's a rewind. Here's a save state. Whatever. What do you make of this dimension of the conversation? I guess it's almost like a meta point, the difference between remaking a game in a more thorough way, or simply saying, hey man, just go play it again. Here it is. Here we re-released it. Go for it.
Yeah. I think this is a more complicated point than I think people realize.
Yeah.
Because unless it's a service like Nintendo Switch Online, which is a Nintendo emulator. They made this unique emulator that then put their ROMs into, and it allows them to do things like save states and rewinds and online play, but Nintendo made this specific emulator for all of their games, and that's a very specific case that not a lot of games get. And so the idea of just making it available a la carte as a thing you can buy, you know, Xbox still has a lot of their old games purchasable on their store just because they have a different kind of backwards compatibility. PlayStation over the years has actually gotten a lot better at making their old games available a la carte just for you to buy and download and play whenever you want. And so there obviously is a lot of that happening.
Yeah.
But I think what people don't recognize is that even within these, it's really still a remaster. It's running at a higher frame rate. It is running at a higher resolution. There are usually some, even if it's like a framework, a quality of life improvements like a rewind or a like in the Mega Man Legacy collections and stuff like that. It's ostensibly a remake of that game with quality of life features and all of these things that then come with the newer hardware. And so I don't really see why that doesn't frustrate people, but when slightly more effort is put into integrating those quality of life elements, or doing slightly more work to specifically handle elements of the game's design or visuals or frame rate, why that then becomes a more frustrating thing to people, when I really don't think that the goal is all that different. It's utilizing modern technology to play a game better and offer some quality of life features.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're sort of getting at here, which I entirely agree with, is the notion that there actually is a lot of work that goes into this type of project. Because you got to also think about the pitfalls. I mean, is it Ape Escape 2 that wouldn't play right on PS5?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Like if you download like the PS4 version on your PS5, it can work fine. Like
There's a lot of troubleshooting that goes into this, and even in the case of like of Nintendo's NSO emulator architectures, you know, you've got a team like Nerd that is there to do R&D and get these emulators set up.
Do you work for them?
So yeah, there is still effort that goes in here, and I
One second. The incredibly rare insult, like going up to a guy and be like, "Hey, you know what Nintendo team you'd work for? The European Research and Development Team."
I'll tell you this, it is a rare insult.
Yeah, rare insult.
I think that ultimately, or like something like what Bluepoint used to do before Bluepoint
Yeah,
was doing these more lavish remakes, and not even like an Uncharted, go back even further, go back to like their multiplat work on the Metal Gear Solid collection and things like
yeah,
that. There you need a level of knowledge and time and technique to get these games running, right?
hmm
If you it's not as simple as sort of a drag and drop operation in
yeah,
the majority of times,
yeah. Which is
unless
why
yeah.
on NSO or PS Plus or something, of course, there's other reasons, but that's why things don't just drop all at once. Is it's not a you just put the file in and it works. There's some touching up specific game circumstances that where things need to be done a little bit differently. There are specific teams that handle these things. And in some cases it's also a rights thing, like you have to
Yeah.
like work with original developers and platform holders or whatever it is to make sure that re-releasing it is legal.
I mean, Nintendo's probably come the closest to having a very smooth pipeline for this,
Yeah,
to where they have these very flexible emulators for their platforms that they can just funnel games into. It's still not
yeah,
that simple, like if you look at like a um what's it called? New Super Mario Brothers 3, but it's Mario Advance 4, I think. It has like the
sure,
e-reader levels in it that they had to add
yeah,
back in because obviously there's no e-reader, or F-Zero Climax is something similar. So there's still work that goes into these projects, but I think nonetheless what we're highlighting here is not only the effort, which I think is important to recognize,
yeah,
but moreover the fact that a lot of times these types of projects are handled by these
yeah,
external teams.
absolutely,
It's not Nintendo. Even look at something more substantial. Look at like a Wind Waker HD or a Twilight Princess HD or something. I'm
yeah,
sure Aonuma and some key members of that Nintendo EPD3 team are overseeing the project, but that's not their team's project.
yeah,
You're talking about a team like Tantalus that is coming in
yeah,
and really doing the nuts and bolts work
yeah,
here. And so I think this is another thing that I think we often fail to recognize when we're talking about remakes and remasters, that when we're getting up into these more prestigious projects, these
yeah,
retail projects, these games that are critical to a company's calendar year, they're still often not being done in-house.
yeah.
And we can
For the
talk
most
about
part,
yeah,
absolutely,
we can
yeah,
talk about the big major in-house remakes, and we're going
hmm
to. But I
hmm
also think it's important to just separate that out. When you see that remake, you see that
yeah.
remaster, the first question I think you have to ask if you're concerned about resource
Resources, yeah,
use
hmm
is who's actually making it.
absolutely,
Oftentimes, it's not going to be the team that made it in the first place. Not always,
yeah.
and we'll get to that,
I,
but
I
often
I
it's
would
not.
say 80-90% of the time. It's not, of course, if that's incorporating like all the remakes, all the
Yeah,
remasters that come out across the course of the industry. And what I think it when people say I don't want any remakes to happen, I want people to make new games. I think as you're saying, it's a misunderstanding of what certain
yeah,
development teams do, because there are a lot of teams that their sole or primary focus is to do that. And it's similar to there being porting teams that handle,
yeah,
like was it Panic Button or Big Red Button, were the one the team that brought like Doom and
yeah.
Witcher to
Panic button
Switch. Yeah, like that's
or
their
Iron
job.
Galaxy or
Yeah,
Shiver or
absolutely. And then you think about teams that handle just like collections and old remakes and stuff like Night Dive. They do a lot
yeah,
of bringing back old games, putting those into Aspire. Like you're not gonna get all of the old fucking Star Wars games and stuff on or the Tomb Raider games on modern hardware unless Aspire's handling them, knowing the modern technology, revisiting the code, making it playable, making it smoother. That takes effort, and
yeah,
even in the cases of from like PlayStation or Xbox or Nintendo, they have for the vast majority of their remakes, ports, collections, they have teams that handle that. That's what Grezzo did for a
yeah.
long time. That's what Mercury's team did when they remade Metroid 2. That's what Bluepoint did. That's what Nix's does. Like they have these studios that's their job. And while you can say you want video game studios to make new games, can Shiver make a new game? Maybe, but is it going to be that good? Is it going to be better than them or more important to the wider ecosystem for them to make a new game versus using their skills to bring like I'm sure Blue Point could make a good new video game, but their
Yeah,
skills are in understanding and properly translating forward something like Demon Souls or Shadow of the Colossus and making them feel like brand new, full from the ground up games, even though they're based off of original code. And like, I just don't think it's. I think it's underselling the unique skill and talent that goes
I agree.
into faithfully remaking a game. Of course, it can be done poorly. That is a caveat to all of it. There are plenty of bad remakes, plenty of bad remasters. I don't think they're anywhere near the majority of them.
Yeah,
But that's because game developers are people, and sometimes people make bad things. Just because it's based on an old game, you can get a Silent Hill HD collection or whatever the hell. That's just like a bad way to play those games because they did it poorly. But for the most part, when you talk about Grezzo remaking games and Blue Point remaking games, and Nyx is helping to bring games to PS5. It's like they're really good at their jobs, and so
yeah.
it takes a unique skill to actually do that.
I agree, and I mean, even if well, actually, I want to quickly address this point that Phil raises here.
Okay.
Phil the pill, because I think we're making a really good case for a clearer understanding of who is making the remakes, the work that goes into these different scales of projects,
Yeah.
and how that speaks to certain expertises.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all kind of production side.
Yeah.
Phil makes this larger economic point that also sort of intersects with the player experience, and I think it's important to talk about the experience of remakes and remasters as a player, looking into the upcoming months and saying, okay, well, a lot of what I'm going to be playing is quote unquote old.
Mm-hmm.
Phil says this here, and he's making this larger point. It's not remakes are not exclusive to video games.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone complains in every medium that the best-selling pieces of content are derivative and cowardly, and that's just where we are in terms of capitalistic culture of art by monopolies. You want something new, that's a risk. You want people to take a risk, don't concentrate all the capital in one entity that's run by an algorithm. Don't defund the safety net so that artists can actually take a break from the grind and develop on their own if we're not going to question those fundamentals. Then bring on remakes if it gets people paid and they look shiny.
I'm gonna be honest. I got really lost in the weeds there. Do you know what he's saying?
The point Phil is making is essentially the phenomenon of remakes is not unique to games, and it's more illustrative of a late stage capitalist culture that appeals to people through recycling and through probably closer to his verbiage, regurgitating old things again for people to consume once more and be sort of caught up in this cycle of nostalgia that's risk averse, that exists just to peddle what already was popular and use that to sort of build up the bottom line without really taking the time or the chance on something new.
Yeah.
But what he says, and he qualifies at the end, which I think is I don't agree with him, but a point he makes here at the bottom that I think is fair is that if we're not going to challenge that, then by all means keep bringing the remakes, because the remakes are at least a stable source of income. Sure. They get people paid and they look and play well. So I think that's sort of the case Phil is laying out.
Sure. Yeah. What I think is interesting is how he stipulates, or hold on, maybe I was misreading this. It's not just video games, and like this is something that exists across most artistic mediums. But definitely people complain about it. What I think is interesting about the difference for me, and why I see more value in a revisitation or a touch up of video games to re-release them versus I don't know, a fucking book or a movie or whatever, is that video games are technology. Video games are not simply one person's creative vision put out there and it is what it is.
Yeah.
Video games are based on the technological hardware of whenever time they were produced in. And that also comes with, whether fair or not, the shifting tides of technological expectations over time. And the reason, and I think this is the primary reason, most games are remade, is because people prefer things that match their current level of expectation of technology. You're not going to go back and buy an old refrigerator. You're not going to go back and buy an Apple II and expect it to be able to do what your current Mac can do. It's because
Yeah.
technology progresses and standards progress alongside that. And video games do fit into that. And so, whether this is really what comes into like the art versus being remade and like how does that impact the project um, conversation that I think we'll definitely get more into as we go on. Um, People want the game that they're currently playing for. I'm saying people in like the generalist
Yeah.
majority, uh, to play well and look good and match their technological expectations for now. Like so, that's why I think it makes a lot more sense for video games as opposed to like someone uh, remaking a book or remaking a movie. Is you can engage with a book or a movie in the same way that someone did, 100 years ago. But it's just not true that video games are experienced the same way now as they were in the 80s or 90s.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, anybody who watches Quest will know that I love nothing more than to turn everything into a larger economic issue. But I think that there is a point when capitalism is not always the reason for every single thing happening. I think you're making a good point about audience expectation, but I think there's also just a point to be made about the artistry of a remake. And the fact that, as we've talked about quite extensively in our video about viewing games not as art, but as product and the benefit of that, you know, there is always going to be some sort of financial incentive for a remake. That's just factual. It's why any game is greenlit unless it's an itch.io project. Every
Yeah.
game is expected to make a profit. If you think about it, something like The Last of Us Part 1, and we can move into Adam's comment here in a
Oh, sure.
moment
Great.
here.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll do that now because it addresses what Phil is saying, I think.
Sure. Great.
If they're in conversation, then I'll rebut both.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, go ahead.
You've been reading all those things. Adam Hurd says, the remakes I feel exhausted by are those I feel don't need to exist. The famous example is The Last of Us, getting a remaster a year after it was launched. And so he then lists out all of the different versions of the Last of Us series that have been made available, which is, of course, the original game in 2013, Last of Us Remastered in 2014, Part 2 in 2020, Part 1, the full ground-up remake of the first game in 2022, and The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, which was the PS5 and PC version that was a re-release of The Last of Us Part 2 with some extra content and stuff. So he goes on to say, 3 of these titles are remakes, and 1 is a DLC. He mentions Left Behind in there. I don't really know why he brought that in the conversation, but whatever. In 10 years, The Last of Us 1 has had 2 separate remakes. There are more remakes of The Last of Us than there are original games in the series at this point, and it's absurd, honestly. Every time Sony pumps out another remake of a game that launched a few years ago, it kind of just makes me angry at those resources aren't being put to better use, making something new and interesting. There's a lot of texture here I really want to get into.
Yeah, I mean, I just think because this dovetails to me with what Phil is saying because I think that Naughty Dog is often looked at as like the archetypal illustration of remakes as
Yeah.
a bad money grubbing phenomenon.
As a crutch.
And I just think that that's wrong. I mean,
Yeah, I don't think it's fair at all.
I think that as a macro point, Naughty Dog is a punching bag explicitly because they make games on a level of quality and vision that not a single other team in the industry reaches, and people don't like that. I'm not saying that's what Adam or Phil believes. That's just a larger point I think about the completely unfair treatment of Naughty Dog writ large in the culture, but. I had the real pleasure of speaking to Sean Eskeg and Matthew Gallant, who are the game director and creative director on Last of Us Part 1.
Mm-hmm.
And in speaking with them, I came to really realize and appreciate the amount of work that went into the technical dimension of that project. And not only the physical labor, but the artistic intent. They were talking with me about how like when you go to the university towards the back half of The Last of Us and you're going into the dorms and you're going through sort of these decrepit
like fall or winter or whatever.
yeah these decrepit labs and dorm rooms and bedrooms and everything. They're talking to me about how simply their new lighting engine that they were using was making a space too bright, and they had to look at that and say, okay, well, this is undercutting the mood. So we need to go in here and we need to adjust the lighting so we obscure this part of the room in shadow and better
Mm-hmm.
convey the sense of unease in our characters.
Hmm.
There's a deep, 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 deep level of thought that went
That's
into Last
so
of Us
many
Part
deeps.
1.
Holy fuck.
Every element of that game was considered to bring it to a sort of gameplay feel parity with Last of Us Part 2, to
Yeah.
make sure that the increased fidelity was not undermining the emotional experience of the original release.
Yeah.
And so I just don't think you can look at that kind of work and say that it was wasted. I
Mm-hmm.
just don't think that's true at all. You know, if I were to sit down somebody that had never played The Last of Us and wanted to with the 2013 PS3 copy, we might sit here as an in group and say, well, that's amazing. I promise you that somebody playing that PS3 version for the first time in 2025 is going to say, this looks old as hell.
Yeah.
There is an artistic value in these stories, as you were saying, being brought to where players expect them to be. The
Mm-hmm.
Last of Us Part 1 is among the, in my opinion, 10 most important games ever made.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
Well, the Last of Us or Last of Us Part One?
sorry, the first Last of Us
Yes. Yes.
as
Yes.
just an idea.
As both, sure. As yeah, and as technically both of them. Yeah.
To not have something like that always available is silly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that you can look at the management of Naughty Dog and say that it was poor, and we've come to learn now from interviews that Shuhei Yoshida's been doing that they
Yeah.
worked
Yeah.
for 4 years on this multiplayer game at the same time they were releasing these stopgap projects to keep cash flow into the studio to work on a new project.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Canceling that was silly, but they canceled it to make Intergalactic. So you need to look at not only, I think, the artistic value and effort being put into these. You need to not
Yeah.
only look at how that impacts the player, but I think Phil, you have to linger on what you said at the end. The cash
Mm-hmm.
flow from these remakes is necessary for Naughty Dog to keep putting the level of time into their games that they do. I
Yeah.
mean, say what you will about whether or not a studio like Naughty Dog should spend 6 years on a project,
Mm-hmm.
a new project. I don't think that
Yeah.
that's great. But
6 years because Intergalactic is going to come out next year, and I actually do believe that.
I do too. But if you are a team at that level of the industry and your goal is fidelity, I don't think we're ever going to say to Naughty Dog, compromise on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if they're not going to compromise on that, they need the cash flow. Where are they going to get it from? They're going to get it from making sure that their seminal works that have shaped the industry and touched players deeply are always available at that highest fidelity. I just think
Yeah.
that
Sure.
it's to the benefit of the studio and the player that these things happen.
Yeah, and I totally agree. The interesting thing about the amount of detail you went into about the effort that went into Part One and the way that it reflects Naughty Dog's modern culture and skill, I think are very, very important. I think that is I think it's a realistic justification of it, but I don't necessarily think it. I don't think that actually goes against. I think it kind of supports Adam's complaint about this stuff. Is that a lot of resources went into remaking The Last of Us.
Sure.
And I think it's worth it. I haven't played Last of Us Part 1, but I'm sure I will at some point. I'm sure I would really appreciate it. But I'd like to shift our focus to the other elements of what makes this so crazy, because I think if it was just The Last of Us, you wait literally 7 years, it's Last of Us 2, and then The Last of Us Part 1 comes out, and those are the only three games in this series. We can use that in weird air quotes. I don't think people would complain as much. I think it is Last of Us Remastered as a really a historical example of people being like, this is unnecessary. It came out right after it's called Remastered, all this stuff. That is emblematic of the obsession with remakes in the industry. And then, of course, The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered 4 years after The Last of Us Part 2, being the PS5 version, also coming to PC.
Yeah.
I think that those two games are really interesting because I don't understand why they frustrate people. Because let's bring in something that Daniel mentioned, which is he wants the games to be available on modern hardware. Great. I think Adam would more than likely agree with that. I don't really know what Adam thinks about The Last of Us. I don't think it really matters in this time. I think he would probably agree that he wants The Last of Us to be available for people to play on modern hardware. And we take a look at The Last of Us releasing in 2013, the year that the PS4 released.
Yeah, 6 months, less than 6 months before PS4 came
Yeah,
out.
and Abram, same thing with Last of Us Part 2, though, of course, PS5s are backwards compatible. But let's remember back to PS4, PS4s are not backwards compatible.
Yeah.
And so, ostensibly, what Naughty Dog did with The Last of Us and 12 months later, whatever, The Last of Us Remastered, is made a cross-gen version of The Last of Us. As far as I know, The Last of Us Remastered doesn't have a ton of stuff in it. It's a better textures, better resolution, better frame rate, but it's not like The Last of Us Part 1, where it's a from the ground up engine rechange and all of that. It's ostensibly a cross-gen version of The Last of Us, and I think people would not care at all if they didn't call it The Last of Us Remastered. If it was just The Last of Us, same box art, has a PS4 thing at the top, and it was released a year later because the PS4 is out at this point, who would give a shit? No one would complain about that. They'd be like, oh, it's a cross-gen version. If it was the exact same game that was running at the better resolution, better frame rate, better lighting engine because it's on PS4, better hardware, and it was just not called remastered, I don't think people would care. And with Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, again, it's called remaster. If it was Last of Us Part 2 and it was just the PS5 version, it runs a little bit better, and it includes the extra stuff that Last of Us Part 2 Remastered does, I think if it wasn't called remastered, people wouldn't care as much. I think it's the marketing effort that goes into it that makes people aware of the effort that's been put into these things, that makes people annoyed at them. If they just dropped Last of Us Part 2 as a PS5 version, it's an update, we included a couple extra things, I don't think anyone would give a shit. But it's the fact that they have trailers for it and they release it on a new physical disc and it says the word remastered on it that creates this expectation that this is something that a ton of effort went into, when of course, some work went into both The Last of Us Remastered and Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, but it's not the kind of resource-draining major project I think people think that they are. And so I think it's a context, expectation, marketing thing that creates this enhanced attention on this, that people are like, oh, this is a waste of time, when it's neither of those were major projects. They were, I think, very smartly utilized to continue to keep the games fresh and updated. And again, I think the marketing thing keeps sticking in my head of would you care if it was just the Last of Us PS4 version?
I think that's a really good point. Because I was doing a little bit of, I just Googled really quickly Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, and if you go to the PlayStation blog cites that Matthew Gallant is the game director for Last of Us Part 2 Remastered.
Yeah.
So there were Naughty Dog resources that went into this project.
Yeah.
However, let's remember that came out in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of 2024, Intergalactic was announced. Matthew Gallant is also a co-director of Intergalactic with Neil Druckmann. This is where I think, to me, the resources spent on something like Last of Us Part 1 are very important. And my contention, beyond any way people come to feel about the marketing speak that these games are talked about with, or what goes into them, at the end of the day, Matthew Gallant working on Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 Remastered as game director equipped him to do Intergalactic.
Yeah.
You get better new games by remaking these old games.
Yeah.
And training yourself on them.
Mm-hmm. Especially in the current context where a new major release takes so long that especially first-time game directors don't get the chance that they did 20 years ago to have that repetition, have a bunch of releases, iterate a little bit.
Yeah.
You're going to get the director of Intergalactic, his experience is in doing remakes, not in doing all of these other Naughty Dog games, because Naughty Dog games take 5-6 years to come out.
And Matthew Gallant has been with Naughty Dog for a long time, and he worked on more less senior roles on earlier iterations of Last of Us, and then on Uncharted. I think he joined around Uncharted. I don't know if he was there for the Jack stuff or whatever, but the point is, those are an opportunity for him to play up and get a sense of the responsibility of that role. And your dev dive with Xavier Nelson Jr. has this really interesting point he raised about the differences in the amount of credits you could accumulate as a designer maybe 2 decades ago compared to now if you only work in the AAA space.
Yeah.
And then obviously he has more credits than fucking anybody in like an 8-year period. But I think it's important that you gain experience, and this is another way to gain experience.
Yeah,
And even if you want to say, okay, well, being the game director of a remake is not the same as a ground from the ground up new project, I agree with you. But still, learn how to manage a team, learn how to manage your timelines, understand the nuts and bolts of the directorial process. There's a lot that
yeah.
goes into being a game director. Think about also Metroid Prime Remastered.
Hmm.
Um, I believe
Or
it was
Samus Returns,
well,
or Pikmin 3.
I specifically say Prime 4 Remastered though, because Retro made Remastered,
Yeah,
and I believe it was the UI director or some kind of UI artist on Prime 4 Beyond put out a tweet after Beyond had been shown off last June, being like, "Hey, working on Metroid Prime Remastered gave me a lot of skills and a lot of
yeah,
knowledge that I'm applying to Prime 4 Beyond, and it's made me a better designer."
hmm,
I think that that there is, in my opinion, a linear progression from remake to new game, and a quantifiable bump in confidence of
yeah,
the
sure,
artist working on the project for having worked on the remake.
yeah,
So I think that that's another important dimension of the conversation. It's not just about how does it benefit the player, it's also how does it benefit the developer, and not
sure,
simply financially, artistically, creatively. What new skills are they
hmm,
gaining that let them
yeah.
make that new thing as good as it can be and better?
Well, definitely, and I think another example of that, of course, this requires a little bit of projection, but I think it's fair projection. Is what a development team gets from like essentially wiping the slate clean,
Yeah.
revisiting some of their older work. Why did it work? How can we revisit it? How can we use the skills that we have gained to improve it, but also make sure we stay true to that original vision? And you think of something like Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door.
Yeah.
Paper Mario, a series that has been very contentious within its fan base for reinventing itself, not returning to its roots, and now we have Paper Mario: Thousand Year Door on Nintendo Switch, a very faithful, very good remake of that game. It would shock me if the next Paper Mario game isn't more like the Thousand Year Door than Color Splash, Sticker Star, or Origami King was. Because Intelligent Systems has now had the opportunity to go back, revisit why that game worked. Obviously, they understood that the audience was really hungry for specifically that kind of experience. And now that they've spent years working on that specific game, the remake, they're going to take that knowledge that they learned of why that game worked and why it was special and why it resonated with players and apply it to their next game.
Yeah.
And I think it's more than likely the next new Paper Mario game is going to be the second favorite after Thousand Year Door, or like the true successor to Thousand Year Door that we didn't get for like literally like 15 years because they went back and remade that game. I think that
Yeah.
there's an important like uh, understanding that you get from refamiliarizing yourself really deeply by working on that kind of project.
Yeah, and I want to read a comment here from Siscott who
Yeah.
says, "I know it's fun to clown on developers constantly doing remakes and remasters, but I honestly think it gives teams things they can do and content players can play." That's astute. Uh, a lot of time, these remasters and remakes help make up budget for new games in respective series. We know that Nintendo and PlayStation are very fond of doing ports, remakes, and remasters to gauge interest, and it helps with finding statistics on if there's a player base. Heck, some of my most wanted games are remasters of older games that help
Mm,
with having a fresh set of eyes on a series that has gone dark. And I
sure.
think this dovetails really nicely, not only with the point you're making about, I'm sure, what Intelligent System is going to carry forth, as long as I don't look at the fact that Origami King outsold Thousand Year Door 2-1, but that's a different
Yeah.
conversation. You were raising earlier the examples of Pikmin and Metroid, and there's no doubt that Mercury Steam's successful reimagining of Metroid 2 is what opened the door for them to do
Yeah.
Metroid Dread, and
100%.
moreover demonstrated to Nintendo that they have a reliable partner that can do this.
Yeah.
And I also think that
Or even think to like Toys for Bob making Crash 4. It
yeah,
was their experience
exactly.
with Spyro Remastered and Insane Trilogy that they familiarized themselves with the style of design and they were able to then apply that to the first new mainline fucking Crash game in like literally 20 years.
Yeah. So I think that the point you're making and Siscott's making together about, again, the value of the remake as like the, Because you ever seen like you ever heard of like a spaceship, like a rocket ship?
Have I heard of that?
Yeah.
That's a big question. Yeah, I
You
have.
launch a rocket, and then there's like the
Boosters.
start the boosters, the starter
Yeah,
engine that breaks apart, and then
yeah,
the rest of the rocket can go to the moon
yeah.
or
And by
whatever.
the way, I see you as my booster. I am ready to jettison you as soon as I hit fucking Mach 10.
When they reach the moon or those other planets that are up there, apparently. Um, I think we can't ignore that, but I also think we should read another comment here
Yeah, we have a
from
bunch of them.
Scruffy, who's
Mm-hmm.
also talking about another great value to the player.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to read this one?
Sure. Scruffy says, in general, I really like the idea of remakes and remasters. For the most part, seeing classic games get a new leaf on life on a new platform and become easily accessible is something I will never ever complain about, even if I don't like the series as being brought back. I know there's debate about physical ownership, but in an age when digital is becoming more commonplace, it makes rare games more accessible to the average consumer. Before a game like Xenoblade Chronicles was re-released on 3DS and of course the Switch to a larger extent, you had to go out and track down a copy for the Wii and pray you could find one at a decent price. With the advent of digital storefronts, anyone can pick up a game from anywhere, and remasters and remakes are a great way to make sure that can happen. And especially for long-running series that folks might not have heard of, the ease of being able to download whatever you want whenever you want is a great advantage that has obviously contributed to the success of series that were niche at one time.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's just a really evident point. And Paper Mario is another great example. Actually, it was Adam that raised that, but I wanted to paint Adam as a negative hater. That's not true.
As a
It's
weeb.
just that Scruffy already made this point. But
Yeah.
Thousand Year Door is another great example of a truly hyper expensive game.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, the price has come down on that in the
Yeah.
wake of the release of the remake, which is cool. But let me put you this way: it's a hard ask to get people into old series sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
You want a nice, clean, oftentimes more accessible or easier version of some of these old games
Yeah.
to recommend to people. Here's a great example: Devil May Cry 3. The original version
Sure.
of Devil May Cry 3 is like way harder, it's way more restrictive. Nowadays, though, if you want to play DMC3, you don't even go to the version that's on PS4 in the HD trilogy. You go to the special edition on Switch,
Yeah, yeah.
which has all these new mechanics for weapon switching that's more fluid, that just makes the game more fun, more enjoyable. And
Yeah.
maybe you can make some kind of point about the intent of the original work, and we can get into that. But I ultimately just feel like, you know what? It's a lot of the time for a lot of these seminal games, it's the broad strokes that make them so beloved.
Absolutely.
No one like if I want somebody to play DMC3, I don't want them to go back and have to switch weapons at a fucking save statue.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
go and fuck around with all the weapons and all the stances on Switch, and you're gonna get why DMC3 is an amazing game. You don't need to go back and play that really crunchy old PS2 version. You just don't have to do it. Same with Katamari. You want to play
Sure.
Katamari with the modern controls? That's awesome. That's how I did it. I understand why
Yeah.
Katamari is so special. I think that we get too hung up on the particularities when what Scruffy is saying is totally true. Give people the most fun, accessible, inviting
Yeah.
version of these classics and these hidden gems, and get it to them as easily as possible.
Yeah. I completely agree with you.
Yeah,
This is the point where I think the most frustrating contention comes from. Because
sure.
I think it's, to me, the point against a remake or remaster that has the most legs to stand on, which is how a remaster makes changes to the original vision of the creator
Yeah,
and then makes it a different experience from that original. And the reason I understand it is because I do respect the creative vision of developers. I know that there certainly are examples of like the Halo Combat Evolved remaster that some of the original creators weren't particularly happy with because it made changes that were like, no, we didn't want that to happen, and now people are just gonna play that one, and we wish it had been the original, like that we wish they hadn't made those changes. There are certainly examples of that, and I think that that's there's value to that, but it I think it misunderstands that people enjoy games for different reasons. And a game, whether let's specifically, I want to focus on Silent Hill 2 because that's a game that just had a
Sure.
very big remake that changed a lot of elements of the game. Silent Hill 2 was a beloved game for a really long time, but it was also a game that, because it was basically exclusive to older hardware in a good playable version, and it was a game that featured older video game design that many current day players don't prefer and would not enjoy, would not be able to appreciate. They gave that a revisit because what they recognized, and I think this is where I see personally the most value in a remake, is that there still is a lot of value to older games.
Yeah.
Stories that were told, environments, characters, iconography that are featured in older games that the whether it's the C-suite because they want to market the fucking the IP or whatever, or revitalize it, or the creators understand there's still value there, and we want a modern audience that has different priorities from the older audience. We want them to be able to appreciate the game, as you said, its broadest strokes. Is it more important that someone appreciates Silent Hill 2 for its atmosphere, for its character design, for the themes that were present, for
Yeah.
the puzzle design, the broad strokes that Bloober Team was able to recapture in their remake? Or is it more, and then you get people who are fans of Silent Hill because they played that version, and they are now able to understand why the characters are so interesting and why the tone and mood of Silent Hill is so unique. Or is it more important, as I think some people would argue, and this is something I disagree with, that people play what the original version of Silent Hill 2 was, warts and all. And I can understand the value in that. But for me, I like that we now have two versions of Silent Hill, two versions of Pokemon Gold and Silver, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, right? We have these remakes that can exist in conversation, and someone can play
Yeah.
the original version or play the new version, and they both get an experience that delivers the broad strokes intent of what the creator appreciates, but each version is able to speak to different audiences. And I think that's what most remakes are for, is to speak to a new audience. They're not
Yeah.
made to speak to the original audience that already has access to the game. Of course, maybe it's not directly available, maybe you have to emulate it, maybe it's expensive to get a cartridge. I understand that. But they want to bring in new fans. And so you make these changes to reflect the fact that you want a different kind of person to be playing that game, and you need to therefore revisit its design, revisit its controls, revisit its art direction, graphics, whatever, menu system, save states, to be able to accept that kind of person in. You and I have both found many, many games that we've have stuff to appreciate from that we played on NSO with a ton of fucking rewind, a ton of save states. We cheese those games to shit, but we would not have played through it, probably wouldn't have enjoyed or appreciated those games if we had to play them on modern hardware with no changes whatsoever. The changes that were made by putting it on NSO and giving us these modern affordances allowed us to complete the game, see it through, and appreciate it for its broad strokes value, not because it's this one specific thing that you need to be one specific kind of player to appreciate.
Yeah.
It lets different kinds of players approach it from their what they prefer and find a middle ground, which I think is really important.
I think it's a skill issue to look at a remake and feel as though it has, in the cultural sense, in a practical sense, an artistic sense, replaced the original game.
Mm.
I really like your point about the old and the new being in conversation, because
Yeah.
why wouldn't they be?
Mhm.
What's so bad about a remake that's fundamentally different? Go play the original.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I just don't I think that there's a feeling that I think is the community buying into the sort of forward march of progression and marketing, that the remake is now the thing, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not. It's a version of the thing.
Yeah.
And so you can have both. I really like your point there. And I think that actually our friend Murph dovetails this really
Right?
nicely with points about the Resident Evil remake, saying
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
a common
Definitely.
request with game remakes is to update outdated, clunky design for modern audiences. Remake RE remakes 2 and 3 do this by making the PS1 Resident Evils into over-the-shoulder shooters with shiny modern graphics and modern cinematic cutscenes. However, the existence of all these indie titles trying to be like PS1 Resident Evil tells me that there's something the remakes are missing, be it
Yeah.
tone or gameplay, that can't be captured by making a game shiny and cinematic. That doesn't say that the remakes are bad. They're quite good, but they're not quite remakes if they invoke such a different vibe. That's why I
Hmm.
prefer to call such titles reimaginings.
Sure.
It's newer devs looking at the outline to RE2 and saying, if no one knew what a Resident Evil was, how do we make it today? And that approach is a big reason why Capcom has done quite well with bringing Resident Evil to a new audience while still thriving, while still thrilling their older fans.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a really good point because I to me that's like the fairest way to look at a remake and
Sure.
say this isn't definitive because it there are
Yeah.
remakes that come out and say
Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition.
yeah, or to go back to Last of Us Part One, like the guys at Naughty Dog will tell you this is the definitive version of The Last of Us,
Yeah.
and we went to great pains to make it that way, and that's
Mhm.
cool, and that's one way to put it. But I think that the best way to view remakes is as you're saying, as Murph is saying, as just this is a new take. It's
Yeah.
not the take. And then that
Absolutely.
leaves space for both the original work to be in conversation with it, but as Murph said, as you highlighted here, for other developers to come in and recapture that vibe and build a
Yeah.
canon
Hmm.
around it with your games like Signalis and Crow Country and
Yeah. Yeah.
insert any other fucking 5 million PS1 horror games that
Jesus Christ.
come out these days. But yeah, I'm with you guys entirely. I a good example. I'll give you one more example.
Yeah.
Is the Super Monkey Ball Banana Mania collection,
Sure.
the remakes of 1, 2, and Deluxe. They're not. I prefer the originals significantly in terms of
Hmm.
the physics and various things. One of my greatest mistakes as a critic was scoring that game as highly as I did. However, even that idea of me saying, "Oh, in hindsight, I think that this was kind of underwhelming," is also silly because that's still a cool and different way to play those games. It's more modern. You can jump. You can play as all these different characters. You can remix the levels in all these ways. There's a lot of great value there for somebody who's never played Monkey Ball.
Yeah.
And in some ways, they might find that a lot more inviting than
Yeah.
the really rigid versions of those games on GameCube and on Xbox, not PS2. Don't play Monkey Ball Deluxe on PS2. But why not just have both? It's a two cakes type of situation.
Sure. Yeah. I definitely feel that as well. And one thing I haven't really brought up here is my personal engagement with remakes and
Yeah,
remasters. I mentioned a couple of remake games, re-releases, NSO versions and stuff that I have played. Um, I find myself vacillating, but and taking on a case by case basis whether I would rather play a game's original version
sure.
or a remake. And for me, it comes down to why I'm going to play a game. If I'm going to play a game for its historical value, and to understand its context from the time and why game's design trends were so influential, why certain moments were so iconic, I'll go and play its original version. Of course, I'm the kind of person that, with my personal modern sensibilities, would like to play a game probably through an emulator. If it's on NSO, if it's on PS Plus, I'll play it through that, or I'll emulate it on my Steam Deck where I
Yeah,
can see it in a high resolution, use save hits if I want to. But oftentimes, I will want to play the original game. But then there certainly are some examples of where I know I will not like that original version,
sure.
but I want to be experienced with that game in general. And so then I will go look for the updated version that matches my interest and sensibilities a little bit more, and it allows me an in to whatever that world is. I think Silent Hill 2 is an interesting example because I played the original Silent Hill. I think it's a good game, but Silent Hill 2 Remake is the one that really blew me away and now makes me a very passionate and interested Silent Hill fan. And I'm much more interested now that I have a Silent Hill game that I personally really love to go back and play the original, play Silent Hill 2, 3, 4, get excited for the upcoming games because I now have an in, and I think that's important. Is again speaking to a new audience, and then once they're a fan of that through the new game,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people then are more interested or forgiving to like stretch their boundaries and revisit the older games because they now have a touchstone. They're like, oh, I love this version of Silent Hill. Let's see where that came from. Let's see what informed this, why people loved it back in the
Yeah.
day, as opposed to just starting from nothing and being like, here's the old game. I don't know if I will vibe with it because of my personal different sensibilities, but I need to face it on its own value. It becomes complicated. And quickly, I just want to mention something that I think Murph said that I found very interesting
Yeah.
is that the existence of indie PS1 horror titles tells him that there's something that the RE remakes are missing. And I think that's totally fair and absolutely valid. People, again, approach and have different interests in game design in different ways. And the value of a Crow Country versus an original Resident Evil 2 or a RE2 remake in the conversation with, Alan Wake 2 and like modern survival horror games, totally different audiences, angles, vibes, understandable. Also, what people kind of fail to recognize is that there's something that the original Resident Evils are missing. I don't want to play those original games. I
Yeah.
played the RE1 and I'm like, I don't really like this that much because it is missing what I like in games. And I played Resident Evil 2 or RE4 remake and I'm like, dude, I love this game. I love Resident Evil. I can't wait to play more of these. The something missing thing isn't only that changes were made to the new version, but also that changes were made to a new version that the other one was missing. A value the other one was missing that then someone can choose which one they prefer, which one they don't care is missing, and go to that one.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and not really thought of that before. I
Well, I
really
mean,
like that.
I think it's just it's a clarity of what we were saying earlier. Let's just say the Ninja Gaiden on NES. And if we had to play Ninja Gaiden on NES, it is missing the things that we were able to that we used to appreciate that game. It's just a way of like kind of framing all of this that I think is maybe it helps people understand the value of a remake a little bit better.
Well, also think about Ninja Gaiden, the Koei Tecmo games too. We just saw Ninja Gaiden 4 get announced, and they dropped Ninja Gaiden 2 Black at the same time. And that's a great doorway in to get people familiar with what the series was, so they can get excited for what it's going to be. Hopefully before too long. I hope that's like a fucking August game. I can't wait to play Ninja Gaiden 4. But yeah, I really like your point about there's a reason that people haven't played those old games or really connected with them, and it's not always because they don't have access. Like I think like there's I know that on a statistical level we have a fractional amount of the total canon of games available, and I can't confirm or deny whether or not I have a good portion of them on my Steam Deck because I can't have them anywhere else. So I'm not trying to sit here and make what I'm about to say. I'm not going to make the statement from a place of ignorance because I know that in a practical sense I'm wrong. But man, there's a lot of shit available to you right now. You know what I'm talking about? Like, and a lot of games that get remade, not all of them, but a lot of them you can play in some original permutation. We got a comment here from Nishquick who says, lately I've been thinking on why remakes are made and which ones should be prioritized. The ones that revamp the experience too much and change the entire feel of the game seem unnecessary to me, and on top of that they seem to tap into nostalgia more than feeling a necessary need. Like as much as I love FF7 Remake and Rebirth, I feel like a much more faithful remake only lasting one game would have been the best outcome. But here's the thing. Final Fantasy VII has been available on digital storefronts for way longer before Remake was around. And moreover, it was a version of the game that was faster, had more options. There was way more. You could make that game a lot easier and a lot more streamlined if you're not a fan of 90s RPGs. I still didn't play it. I wasn't gonna fucking play that. But I loved Remake. Remake was one of my favorite games in the PS4 generation. So I think that what you're speaking to, this idea of what did the original miss out on, is really key. Because it's not that I had no access to Final Fantasy VII, and then when the remake came around, I'm like, well, fuck, this is the only way I can play it. I said there's something in here. There's a special sauce. There's a little ingredient sprinkled into that pot. here that the original never had.
Yeah.
So it's not
Well,
always
and
a
that
question
actually
of
goes back
access.
to absolutely. That
Yeah.
goes back to what I was saying about uh a game I think has different kinds of values that can be
Yeah.
interesting to different people. The story and world and vibe and characters of Final Fantasy VII are some of the most iconic and interesting and thought-provoking and well-written characters and world and themes and whatever that have
Yeah.
ever been done in the video game medium, and that is what made that game so popular. Uh, but it is the original game is also, of course, a wrinkle is introduced when you talk about the modern day port that has these special affordances where you can speed up or like
Yeah.
boost XP or whatever, which I did, and then I still couldn't beat Sephiroth. Uh, um, that's just a true fact about me. That the original had, but it was also an it was a 90s RPG
Yeah.
with all of the grinding and weird camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds and things that certainly have their fans, have their value, not disparaging that. But even me, as someone who's obsessed with the game's history, I don't like grinding. I don't really care for the turn-based
Yeah.
battles of Final Fantasy VII. I don't like, and I actually don't get particularly a large amount of value out of the pre-rendered backgrounds and stuff. I'm like, I think these are cool, but I want to walk around the environment. I don't want to like have to like judge, is this a door? Can I fit here? Because it's the 3D model is on a 2D image. It's something that does not appeal to me. It makes me like that game less.
Yeah.
But I played Final Fantasy VII Remake, and why I completely disagree with Nishquick saying that it's only capitalizing on nostalgia and isn't necessary because they're revamping too much. I think it's necessary because they did revamp it so much.
Yeah, I agree.
It adds so much value to people understanding that world, getting familiar, and the fact that they completely remade it and it was appealing to modern sensibilities. Not erasing the original. That one is still available. The amount of people that are now into the Cloud Tifa Aerith dynamic that are like, oh man, Barrett's such an interesting character because of the way that he's written with his daughter and all of this. There are literally millions of players that appreciate Final Fantasy VII now that
Yeah.
would not have appreciated it if the only version that existed was the original Final Fantasy VII or the port, whatever. And why I don't know if I prefer, but I kind of like the fact that they split the game into a trilogy and expanded it, is I think it allows them to more granularly approach what works, what doesn't about that original game in the modern context. The experience of playing in Midgar versus the experience of playing in the open world, which they cleanly split between Remake and Rebirth, are markedly different design experiences in the modern context. Ostensibly, Final Fantasy VII Remake is like an Uncharted style game where you're like walking down corridors, you fight some enemies, and you move on to the next area. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth it's a fucking Assassin's Creed game. It's an open world game.
Unfortunately.
Those are different design angles that I think require different or they're markedly different experiences. So I think it's important that they were split into different games,
Yeah.
and it allows them to make sure that they're giving as much care and attention as the game deserves by spreading it over the course of, it'll probably be over a decade of, development time and release cadence aligned by the time that the trilogy concludes.
Yeah, that's why I like Murph's use the term reimagining, but I even just say adaptation. This is a different adaptation of the work.
Mm-hmm.
I did a class in college that was about novel to film adaptations and sort of putting the original text in conversation with the film version and trying to figure out what was gained, what was lost, and more importantly what the intent of the new project was. And adaptation is what happened to Final Fantasy VII.
Absolutely.
It goes back to, I think, really your point from much earlier in our discussion about the marketing language sort of overtaking the clear and I think unobjectionable intent of a Last of Us remastered or a Part 2 remastered. Yeah. It's the same with calling Final Fantasy VII Remake Final Fantasy VII Remake. Yeah. That's just a good marketing framing.
It's not even really true.
It's not true almost in any sense.
No.
So it's like, I don't know. I just think we need to reframe the whole conversation.
Sure.
And I think we've done a good job of doing that. We do have one more comment here I want to read out. just because I like making sure we get to everybody here. This comes from our good friend Bo of Shonen Soup fame, who's who's.
I don't think we got to Ricole's either.
Oh fuck!
God, fuck.
We're gonna do both. I don't want to leave anybody out here. There can definitely be some frustration when a studio like Naughty Dog or Retro.
Is this Bo?
Yeah, go an extended period of time without a new release and only remasters. But in general, I think they're net positive across the board, and I am personally happy whenever I see one announced. This is the key point here, I think. With digital libraries likely carrying over for the indefinite future, I want as many old games brought to modern platforms as possible. Bandai Namco is remastering random forgotten Vita games right now, and while I'll probably never play them, it's pretty fucking cool. They won't be stuck on a console no one bought. Hey, 12 million people bought a Vita, Bo.
Yeah. Well, one thing actually that brings up and is interesting is there are some games you cannot just port.
Yeah.
There are some, if you want DS games, 3DS games, Vita games, insert what is it? Consoles that are not traditional. That's what we're looking for. Untraditional console here. Games on untraditional hardware need to be revisited from a design level in order to be playable on modern hardware. And so you can't just say, "Oh, I want Pokemon X and Y to be made available on Nintendo Switch." That game wouldn't work on Nintendo Switch. It doesn't. If you're playing on TV mode, how are you going to do the touchscreen? How are the screens going to be positioned next to each other? How is the battle UI going to have to change? Like, you have to take these things into consideration because it's not necessarily as easy as just make it available. Like, why don't you do that? It's like, well, no. And even with like PS3 games, that architecture of that requires games to be either streamed or from the ground up remade in order to make them actually playable because the technology is simply not compatible. And so I think that's another reason why remakes are important is you have to remake things. You have to reformat them in order to make them available at all.
Well, that's where I disagree because I think the PS5 should have had a whole PS3 cell architecture in it.
That's true. And I think the DualSense should have a back touchpad so we can make sure we can play fucking Killzone Mercenary.
Our last comment here comes from Mr. Ricoli, who says the following. I love remakes personally. They give both devs and players a chance to revisit a past game and to potentially address its biggest flaws while making its strengths even more apparent and also making old games more accessible for everyone in the modern day and possibly even introducing new elements and quality of life improvements which inspire a bold and naturally nuanced modern direction for the series and its stable future, which are always net positives in my book and why remakes are so important.
Yeah. He actually does bring up an interesting point in his next paragraph here where he says, his biggest gripe with remakes is that bad or disappointing games don't get redemptive remakes to make them what they were meant to be or reimagine them into more palatable experiences. He mentions Sonic 06 and Wrath of Cortex. He says, I really think people would be much less cynical and tired of remakes if everyone would remake more than just primarily the classics that everyone already knows and loves. I think that's a really interesting point that, frankly, I haven't really thought about too much before. And I think this is really the capitalistic realities of game development. It takes resources to remake a game. It is a design struggle to remake a game faithfully, or if you're totally revisiting it, that's an even bigger design struggle. But why would Sega greenlight a Sonic 06 remake? That game is so fundamentally weird in so many different ways that it would take probably about the development time and budget of a new video game to revisit that game that has a massive stink on it. And so, I don't mind conceptually the idea of a Sonic 06 remake. I'm sure there are elements of that game's design and music and world and stuff that are valuable. And that could be, I could appreciate through something that fixed up all of its issues. Yeah. But is that worth the time? And I think that for the remakes that take a lot of resources, it's very much will it be worth it to the people? Will they enjoy it? I don't know if people would enjoy a Sonic 06 remake. I don't think Sega thinks that people would. It's possible. But would that help their reputation? Would that be a good use of their resources? It's something that, you really have to think of from this angle at a business perspective of, you got to put effort into this. Like,
Yeah.
that's really a resources game, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's where I think you're totally right to to invoke Phil's comment again. And it is
Yeah.
interesting because, like, Sonic 06, there's actually a really, really, really good fan remake of
Oh
the
yeah.
game.
Mm-hmm.
Or even like Metroid 2, which
Yeah,
seemed
sure.
like it would not get remade.
Mm-hmm.
AM2R
Mm-hmm.
was made by Dr. Moon. And that's a really cool version of the game. So there's, I think there's definitely an appetite in the most hardcore circles, or even
Yeah.
this guy Noah Copeland remade Sonic Triple
Triple
Trouble
Trouble. Yeah.
into Sonic Triple Trouble 16-bit, and I think that game is genuinely amazing.
Yeah.
Sega wouldn't have done it, and
No. No.
but I think, again, I don't think it would be as simple as saying, well, if we lived in a society unmoored from capitalist necessity, that we'd get a remake of Sonic 06. I think
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
I think that again, it goes back to my point from before of that the merit in a remake for the developer often is learning skills to apply to the new work.
Yeah.
What are you going to learn from remaking Sonic 06? Probably
Yeah.
you're probably going to have to make that a fundamentally different game, and what you're going to learn is like, fuck, we shouldn't have, none of this is any good at all.
Yeah.
It's all just what's the point of any of this?
Yeah.
But it actually is a really thought-provoking thing that Rikuli
Yeah. Totally.
raises.
Yeah.
How crazy would it be if they did that?
That'd be crazy. Well, it is actually interesting because
Yeah.
it does bring in some games that do get revisits that are historically not really well received
Yeah.
or like memeified to a certain degree. Like, well, actually, no, I don't think they've revisited Bubsy 3D at all. But oh god, there's just one that I had in my mind. Like Night Dive does these things, like Plumbers Don't Wear Ties,
Sure.
or Daikatana, or like these games that you're like, there's a certain point where the historical intrigue of them, or even
Yeah.
like Croc coming back. I don't think Croc is, one of the worst received games, but like there's a certain point where like these games aren't particularly well received, are revisited.
Yeah.
And for the most part, it's mostly because they've become jokes. like
Gex.
well, oh, that's a great.
Did that
well,
ever
the Gex
release?
games-
Did that trilogy
the-
ever release? That new
I
trilogy?
don't know. It has to be soon, right?
Or Glover?
That did release.
Oh.
That's crazy. But yeah, I think it does happen, but I think the reason it doesn't happen is because most people think it wouldn't be worth their time, and that they are just reasonably confident that people wouldn't like it. And developers want to make games, whether they succeed or not, that people like. And so I think there's just a lot of developers that wouldn't want to be attached to or spend their time on a really difficult remake project of a game that already comes pre-installed with a massive stink.
Yeah, I agree. Is there anything else you feel like you need to say? Anything else you gotta
Well,
get off your chest?
Yeah, there's two more small things.
Okay.
Which is a couple of things that I really think people need to consider when unleashing, like Daniel or Adam did, the sort of frustration with remakes. Is number one, Daniel mentioned in his comment, I wanted to bring this up earlier, but I didn't have the time because our conversation was so amazing. So great. That I just want to make sure I get his quote exactly right here. I'm kind of tired of seeing all remake and remaster announcements. What are you talking about? You're wrong. The State of Play last week had a Metal Gear Solid Delta trailer and Onimusha 2
And Days
Warlords
Gone remastered.
And Days Gone remastered. That is, and there might have been another one or two more or whatever. That is, let's say 3 to 5 max out of like 30 games they showed off. It is not all remake and remaster announcements. That is simply not true. I think they stand out in people's minds because it's like, okay, it's recognizable. I remember it a little better than insert new IP, fucking Once Human, fucking, like whatever new thing that is a new game but people aren't exactly excited about. I think it sticks out a little bit more. But most of the games that release are not remakes. You can play only new games that come out and you will have a perfectly full schedule. It is not decreasing the amount of games you can play that they're releasing these remakes. And where I then think about it is like, okay, let's imagine all of these teams making remakes are making new games. You already don't have time for the remakes. When are you going to play those new games? It is not a this or that thing that suddenly lets you experience a ton of new games. you only have a limited amount of time. They only have a limited amount of resources to make the games. The remakes allow them to get out a game a little bit faster because it's based on older work, and it appeals to the audience that it's looking for. It brings in some old fans, it brings in some new fans, whatever. No game is trying to get everyone, and so remaking a game does not completely erase the fact that there are literally hundreds of new games releasing every month that you can go play if you want to. Yeah. And so I think the sentiment of its the industry is so obsessed with remakes is there's a lot of them, but they are nowhere near most games that are announced or released at any given show.
And it's also just it's more indicative of an issue of management in a lot of the cases of these teams. Like if you want to think about Days Gone Remastered,
yeah,
well, Sony canceled their new game, so that's not the fault. They haven't been slaving away on Days Gone Remastered. Exactly. Nixes have been putting a lot of work on that. They got their fucking game canceled.
Or Retro, great example. Yeah. Retro was primarily working on new games for the last 15 years. We didn't see them, and we're about to see one of them, but it didn't take them all this time and everyone working to make Prime Remastered and Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze on the fucking Switch. It was because the other projects didn't work out. That's the only parts that we saw. And so, you might be frustrated by Naughty Dog or Bend or Retro, but it's not the remake's fault that we're not getting new games.
Exactly.
It's the new game's fault that we're not getting new games because they didn't work out.
Or even, you think about Capcom. Yeah, Capcom does a lot of remakes, but Capcom has tentpole new games every year.
Yeah.
Even in the case of
Resident Evil. Another thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
Well, even in the case of Resident Evil, it's not like we didn't get Resident Evil 8 because they were like, fuck it, we're just going to remake Resident Evil games now. Mm-hmm. And we are going to probably get Resident Evil 9 next year.
Yeah.
Or even Bloober Team, they have that Chronos New Dawn game coming out. Is that this year? Is that coming out this year?
It's supposed to be.
Yeah.
We'll see if it does, but yeah. And I think that's another thing of like, there's all these remakes, but even a lot of the teams that are making a lot of remakes are still also making a lot of new games. Think about Game Freak. Game Freak has been remaking their fucking games for almost as long as the company's been around.
Yeah.
They still release a new generation every 3 years. So like, it's not, and especially in this case, recent case, it's not BDSP's fault that things went sideways or that a game was delayed. It's like, no, they're still putting out all new stuff. And quality be damned.
Yeah.
And even back to, you get Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver. That's a remake. People like that game, so they don't complain about it. I digress. But then you also get Black and White and Black and White 2 on DS. Remake didn't stop. The resources were split fine.
You also get all that in like a fucking 5-year period of time, which is crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just think that a lot of these things are an emotional reaction. I think stepping back, especially on the scale of the industry, and thinking about the development effort that's put into one of these things, the specific teams that are put on to these projects, the scope of announcements, the number of announcements that are in any given showcase, the amount of releases that happen on the scale of the industry. Remakes are not sucking out all the creativity of the industry. They are a part of the modern games industry, but there are so many games, there are so many announcements that are entirely new that you can focus on that if you want. I think it's just, I think it's an exaggeration. I think people feel like it's a much bigger issue for multiple reasons than what it is. And if you actually break down what goes into all this stuff, it's really not, it's not as bad as people make it out to be.
Totally. I totally agree. Everyone's just complaining and they're dumb. Don't you agree, Tucker? That's what you said to me before we started recording.
Wait, no.